Hi class. This first lecture this week is titled Perception, the Brain's Best Guess. This is a particularly relevant discussion for this week given that we've been focusing so much on visual information. We sense an object's size, shape, color, position, relative distance of an object, and so forth, but our minds still have to make some kind of sense out of all that information and try to make a judgment about that object, whether it is useful, is it threatening, is it irrelevant noise? Is it annoying? And so forth. The truth of the matter is, our ability to sense an object doesn't always translate into correct understanding of what an object is, and of course, all the ways in which we perceive it. What actually happens is our brain's cognitive abilities have to figure out, based on the information it gets from the environment. The trouble is sometimes that environmental information is inaccurate, incomplete, or confusing. And our brains have to do this as quickly as possible, all while doing everything else it does at the same time. Considering that our sensory organs aren't perfect and can only provide limited information about what's going on around us, our brains can only make the best guess it can about what is happening. So this picture is a little bit dated now, but perhaps you may have seen it floating around on the internet and the social media several years ago. Still, it's a great example because it makes use of the idea that there is some variation in how people's sensory organs can differ, but also there's going to be some difference in how people's brains make sense of that information. This image created quite an interesting discussion because there could be two different people looking at the same photo at the same time, and one person could see a certain color pair that was completely different from the person sitting next to them. At least part of the explanation here is that one person's brain is making a judgment about what colors they're seeing, and another person might be making a different judgment about the colors that they're seeing. In other words, the light coming off this dress is actually really vague, and there is somewhat of a chance that different people's brains will in fact interpret this information differently and actually see them as different colors. All right, so let's break down how this happens. Let's first take into consideration that the photo we were just looking at is actually a cell phone image that isn't a very true to life representation of reality and is probably somewhat pixelated, and obviously it's a two-dimensional image. So our sensory organs, our eyes, are going to take in what this photo is giving us, and that information is then relayed to the color perception area of the cortex. And in that area, several pieces of information are extracted, like taking the two-dimensional object and trying to understand it in 3 dimensions because we recognize the depth of the shadows and the colors, also the lighting conditions, which aren't actually all that great, and then also trying to interpret what these colors actually are in addition to other aspects of color perception. So one thing to remember from the previous slides from one of the other modules in this course is the idea of modularity. But we're not really focused on that at this point. What we're trying to focus on is the conscious and meaningful experience of perception. Here we can think of our brains trying to solve a problem in real time based on our experiences and limited information being sensed by our eyes. Our brain is probably trying to go through this process of, okay, given this subject or this object, its shape, the lighting condition, and any other factors presented, what colors would the dress most likely be? So if you think about the word likely, you might be reminded of a probability or an estimate, and you'd be correct. Based on experience, our brain will try and interpret the information the best way it can. So given that our brain is being challenged to make a best guess based on a limited amount of information, or maybe even some ambiguous information like the cell phone picture being taken in poor lighting, or perhaps the photo quality itself wasn't all that great. Maybe the cell phone wasn't all that advanced in terms of its camera. Who knows? But a couple of examples of what our brain might be doing is assuming that based on the qualities of the photo, it thinks the photo was taken under bright light, meaning that the light blue patches should have been dark blue in reality, and the dark gold patches should have been black. In other words, the photo is overexposed or blown out, and the brain believes that the lighting conditions were therefore too bright and watered down the dark blue and glare the black into gold. On the other hand, the brain could also be assuming that the picture was being taken in very dim light, which would cause our brain to interpret the light blue as probably white in reality and the dark gold patch as probably a brighter gold in reality. In other words, the shadowing on the light blue is actually improperly illuminated white, and the darker gold patches are similarly lacking the proper illumination. So again, the brain is making some assumptions about what is going on in the context of the photo to try and make sense out of what kind of sensory information it is being provided with. And of course, the sensory organs themselves don't make these assumptions. It's the brain itself that does that, and it does it based on its past experiences of similar situations. And as if this wasn't bad enough, the brain also has to consider what part of the photo it is going to use as a reference. If you look at the photo again, what you'll notice is that the top of the dress appears to be under a brighter light than the lower portion. Once the brain decides on which part of the photo it is going to use as the basis for its judgment, it then engages in a top-down influence to rule out other possible interpretations of what the brain is receiving in terms of information from its senses. Of course, there are some folks who see the photo one way, but when their attention is directed to a different part of the photo, their brain's interpretations of the colors might change. Other people have some ability to switch back and forth more readily, but one professor I know here at ASU actually saw the photo one way, and then she enlarged the photo on her computer screen and just took a subsection of it from the bottom. And what she found was just looking at certain parts of the photos, she actually saw the colors differently. So we're going to take a look at that in the next couple of slides here. So here is the upper part of the photo. And as you can see, the upper part of the photo has some glare on it. And so our brain might actually say, what's going on here? There's a lot of light in this photo. It is possible that this black color in here is actually gold. And this darker blue color could actually be white, but because the colors are so blown out, it just comes out this way. And so we might interpret that as a overexposure, and then therefore our brain makes its adjustments into thinking that the colors exist when they may not really be there. And so in the lower part of the photo, what we're seeing is a lot less glare, and what we see is I think deeper and richer colors, so we're more likely to say, okay, yeah, this is definitely blue and black, as opposed to two other colors in the upper half of the photo, which could deceive us. Something else we learned about this phenomena is that our brain is literally making decisions about what we're seeing at a level that we're not even aware of. One of the questions you might be asking yourself at this point is, well, Dr. Frizzell, if this top-down influence sort of automatically happens in our brain where it's making judgments and interpreting sensory information at a subconscious level, should I be concerned that my mind is doing things that even I'm not aware of? Well, unless we're actually being challenged about what color we're seeing, or what kind of sensory information we're coming into contact with, and challenging that by talking to other people who have different perceptions. And in the example of the dress, having a dialogue with other people about what their perceptions are, we might have just, given it a cursory glance and even in just one moment, not given it much thought, maybe noted the color and moved on. But because this specific example of the dress was kind of hotly debated, we can go back and take another look at it and make some attempts to undo the process that the brain already started and challenge that decision that the brain made by going back and trying to reinterpret the information, sometimes more than once. And even then we can still get stuck in our original interpretation of it, because it's really hard to undo what your brain is doing once it is interpreting stimuli. It can take quite a bit of extra work to undo that. Now, I know there have been lots of books and movies out there that play a part in this idea that whatever reality you think you're in, you're wrong, like The Matrix or something like it, where they convince you that your reality is just a bunch of information received by your sensory organs. It's being interpreted by your brain. But to be honest, there is some truth to this. I think what we have to do is focus on the fact that we come into some stimulus in our environment that can be interpreted differently by various people, like whether a certain smell is pleasurable or stinky, what color the dress is that we were just looking at, or even whether your music really is too loud. There generally is a consensus about what most people consider to be reality, but back to the dress controversy, there can be what we consider to be an objective reality, because if people get to see what this dress looks like in reality, in real life, face to dress, there should be a general consensus about what color it really is. And therefore, we wouldn't have to expect our brains to have to figure it out based on some ambiguous photo. However, to really bake your noodle, imagine if humans could see color like certain types of other animals or maybe insects that have a wider spectrum of colors they can see. Would we go back and look at this dress and it would be a completely different color than black and blue? Or again, our minds are limited by the capabilities of our sensory organs. Another example, we can't hear the same sounds that many animals can hear because we're just not capable of it based on our anatomy. But what if we could? What if club music sounded even worse than it already does because we could hear even more frequencies than we already do? So the answer to these questions is our subjective interpretation of reality would be different if our sensory organs were different. Anyway, I just wanted to give you guys that information, and hopefully you can come up with some ideas of your own for your learning journals. Thanks for listening and have a great week.